So Hobbes spends a fair amount of time in the Leviathan painting this gloomy, dystopic picture of what the world would be like, the state of nature, where human beings are in this world of relative scarcity, interacting absent constraints of civil authority or reason. And so we might ask, well, why is he doing this? Well, it's this picture that he wants to paint that he's going to use as his argument for understanding the nature and normative force of both our natural rights and our natural laws. Now, this is something that Rachel doesn't emphasize in this chapter at all, but it's an important idea in Hobbes. Natural rights and natural laws dictate the sorts of social contracts that are legitimate, and they dictate when social contracts are illegitimate. And so they're important. They're also innovative in a way because they really suppose that all people have rights and that there are laws that everyone, including the monarch, must adhere to. And so how does Hobbes go about doing that? Well, first he wants to argue that within the state of nature, all rational agents have what he calls natural rights. And what are natural rights? Well, natural rights are just nothing more than the liberty to do something or to forbear or not do something. So every agent has control over their actions in the state of nature. So agents have freedoms. This is true for all agents, and all agents have an equal amount of freedom. They can exercise all their various strengths and weaknesses to pursue their desires, to avoid their aversions. But they also have dictates of reason that he calls natural laws. And what are natural laws? Well, natural laws are rules or imperatives. They're normative rules. And they're normative because they are always the most rational course of action. They are universally the best choice to make given the state of the world and the nature of human beings. And so the authority of natural laws derives from the fact that they are always the most rational course of action in Hobbes' mind, where the most rational course of action is the course of action that prevents things like the state of nature. So in general, a law of nature, or he calls them lex naturalis, is a precept or a general rule. It's found out by reason, and it forbids man, i.e. human beings, to do what is destructive of their lives or that take away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which they think it may be best preserved. So the idea is that natural laws are constraints that are universally true on how people can act because those constraints prevent us from acting in ways that are self-defeating. So on page 80 of the Leviathan, at least in the copy that I linked to, the first and foremost right, which is the liberty to do something or to not do something, that every person has in the state of nature is the liberty that each person has to use their own power as they will for the preservation of themselves. So everyone has the right of self-preservation, first and foremost. Correspondingly, he argues, the first natural law, the obligation seen to be held as universally normative, action guiding, is to seek peace and to follow it. And so what Hobbes wants to argue is that if we don't seek peace and follow it in all cases where it is possible, then what we're going to do is end up falling victim to conflicts, competition, diffidence, desire for glory, are going to actually undermine our ability to accomplish our goals, to seek the objects of our desires and avoid the objects of our aversions. And this, he thinks, is universally true. So what's the second natural law? Well, the second natural law obliges people to be willing when others are also willing, as far as peace and defense of themselves is promoted by it, to lay down their rights to all things and to be contented with only as much liberty as they would allow other people against themselves. So the second law essentially obliges, dictates, requires of rational agents that they enter into contracts with other rational agents. And so the first and second laws then require every person in the state of nature to contract with one another, to enter into commonwealths. Right? Societies that create a centralized authority, promote peace, enforce contracts, protect people from internal and external threats. So what are contracts for Hobbes, though? Contracts consist in voluntary, mutual transferring of rights between individuals. And remember, rights are just freedoms. So when you transfer a right, you say, I will no longer do this, or I will no longer forbear from doing this. All right? And you do that to get some benefit, all right? Get some resultant good. And so to have a contract for Hobbes, you're going to transfer some of your rights, and you're going to get a benefit for that. Now for Hobbes, he thinks that the only truly effective form of government, the only commonwealth that really can accomplish the goals of a commonwealth, the only stable form of government, is one in which all the power is centralized in a monarch or similar authority. So he's advocating monarchy, sovereign absolutism. However, even the monarch is going to be constrained by the laws of nature, and they can't try to exceed the rights that are granted to them for the purposes of creating peace and enforcing contracts, and for the purposes of protecting people from internal and external threats. And insofar as the monarch is constrained by that, then the monarch's power is granted by the consent of the governed. They are in this mutual implicit contract with each other, in which the monarch is granted the power to create civil society, and the people who grant him the power are the governed, and they do so because of the benefits they receive from social society. Now, because that's the case, there are real limits on what the monarch can and can't do, what civil authority can and can't do. And there are also situations in which one has to submit to civil authority, and situations in which one is allowed to disobey governmental commands. And so he argues that submission to absolute political authority is going to be the only way to achieve peace and stability that he thinks every individual craves. But he's also allowing that each person is granted liberty, and they can surrender this liberty, of disobeying governmental commands that require them to sacrifice their lives or their honors when the Commonwealth's survival doesn't depend on that sacrifice. So in other words, they are granted the liberty to disobey governmental commands that violate the basic natural laws, that impose limitations on their actions that don't promote the social good that is defined under Hobbes's notion of a commonwealth. And so he defines these situations in which civil disobedience is perfectly legitimate. And in contrast, cases in which civil disobedience is completely illegitimate and the consequences thereof. And so Rachel talks about this when he talks about Gandhi's march to the ocean to distill salt in violation of British laws. He talks about this in Martin Luther's decision and advocacy to employ civil disobedience to reverse discrimination encoded into laws in the United States. So this is perfectly consistent with Hobbes's view. Civil authority has limitations. When those limitations are exceeded, when the implicit contract between society and the individual is violated in an egregious fashion, then the individual is always granted the liberty to disobey those governmental commands. There are limitations to civil authority beyond which all commands are illegitimate. But what happens if you break the laws of a commonwealth under circumstances that don't meet that condition of legitimate disobedience? If you break the laws of a commonwealth to a sufficient extent, absent those kinds of violations of the social contract, then the Commonwealth, essentially for Hobbes, expels you. That is, you are no longer granted the benefits because you are no longer acting in accordance. You're no longer paying your dues, so you no longer get the benefits. And as a result, for Hobbes, you're essentially plunged into a state of nature. Right? So you're no longer part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth acts to you in the way that the Commonwealth acts to any external threat. And they will act with unconstrained liberties. Both the Commonwealth and the people who are expelled, they engage in a war of all against all. So it becomes a sort of reservoir dogs kind of situation where once you become a lawbreaker to a sufficient degree, you're now no longer part of the Commonwealth. We can treat you however we treat anybody else. There are no constraints.